I am an avid hiker and recently embarked on a hiking journey in Utah during a cross-country trip I undertook following a breakup with someone I believed would become my fiancée. To summarize, I discovered her in a compromising situation with one of my closest friends, which felt like a profound betrayal from both parties. At the age of 31, I was particularly eager to explore Utah, as it is home to some remarkable forests that every hiking enthusiast dreams of experiencing. I chose the Wasatch Cache National Forest as my destination in Utah, having heard numerous positive reviews about it. One of the forest's main attractions for me was its abundance of secluded areas that were easily accessible. I prefer hiking alone, as crowded trails filled with people do not appeal to me. I selected an unnamed section of the forest and drove my vehicle as far as possible down a narrow access road. After parking, I exited my car and absorbed the beauty of my surroundings. I prepared my gear and checked my phone, noting that there was no service, exactly how I prefer it. I made a mental note of my starting point and commenced my trek. While I am aware that hiking alone in uncharted territory can be perilous, I find that I derive more enjoyment from exploring without adhering to a designated path. I consistently download the digital map of any location I intend to explore. Many individuals are unaware that a phone's GPS remains operational even without cellular service. You might be thinking that I got lost, but that is not the case. I wish I could say that was the crux of my story. However, the reality of my experience is something I am still trying to comprehend. My goal was to reach a lookout point at the mountain's summit, approximately 3 to 4 miles away. The terrain proved to be quite challenging, allowing me to progress at a rate of only about 1.5 miles per hour. About an hour into my hike, light rain began to fall. Since hiking in the rain is a significant annoyance for me, I made the decision to turn back and retrace my steps. Eventually, I caught sight of my car in the distance, and I felt a wave of relief, knowing that this unsuccessful outing would soon conclude. Upon reaching my vehicle, however, I was confronted with a terrifying sight. All 4 tires had been slashed. A sense of fear began to envelop me, as it was inconceivable that all 4 tires had been punctured by mere coincidence. This act was clearly intentional. I quickly scanned the surrounding forest, searching in every direction, but saw nothing. I listened intently, yet any sounds I might have detected were drowned out by the rhythmic patter of raindrops on the leaves and underbrush. I contemplated my options. Without service, I was essentially stranded. I needed to find a way to regain service in order to call for help, but as far as I could recall, I was at a loss. I had lost cellular service over 20 miles down the access road, and the prospect of walking back to civilization appeared daunting. I needed to locate higher ground, and fortunately, the destination I had initially aimed for was just that. I had to take the risk. The thought of traversing 20 miles along the road, exposed and vulnerable, was unsettling. Without further hesitation, I turned back toward the woods and resumed my ascent. I was approximately halfway to the summit when I noticed a faint rustling sound emanating from behind me, roughly 40 yards away. The noise seemed to synchronize with my movements, starting and stopping as I walked. Reluctant to turn around, I quickened my pace, confident that I was a faster hiker than whatever was following me. As the sun began to set, it cast an eerie shadow over the forest, and the persistent rain heightened my anxiety. After creating some distance between myself and the unseen presence, I cautiously glanced over my shoulder. Although I saw nothing, I was acutely aware that someone could easily be concealed behind any of the numerous trees surrounding me. Eventually, I reached the peak, and by some stroke of luck, I regained service. Without wasting a moment, I immediately contacted the police, providing them with the location of my vehicle and detailing the events that had transpired, including my concern about being followed. I also informed the operator that I had AAA assistance. I hung up, feeling a sense of relief that someone was now aware of my whereabouts. A significant issue remained, as I needed to find my way back through the forest before darkness enveloped the area, all while evading the individual who appeared to be following me. I realized that a direct route back would be unwise and could lead to complications. After a moment of contemplation, I decided that a semicircular path toward my vehicle might be the best approach, with the hope of sidestepping any potential traps. I walked parallel to the cliff for a time before entering the woods from a different direction. However, I had not thoroughly examined this part of the forest, so I accessed the map on my phone, hoping my navigational abilities would suffice. For a while, everything seemed to be going smoothly. I had not detected any unusual sounds around me. However, I may have spoken too soon, as less than 30 seconds later, I heard a twig snap to my left. I turned to investigate but saw nothing. Moments later, another noise emerged, this time from directly behind me, sending a chill through my veins as I realized there were multiple individuals present. I quickened my pace, transitioning into a light jog, though the situation was already quite alarming. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a makeshift campsite hidden within the woods, consisting of about 12 logs arranged in a circle around a fire pit. It was evident that someone had been there recently. I jogged past it, frequently glancing over my shoulder. A few minutes later, I heard a noise to my right and turned just in time to catch a glimpse of a foot disappearing behind a tree. That was the breaking point. My light jog transformed into a full sprint through the woods, disregarding the noise I was making, as my only priority was to escape the forest. As I sprinted, the sounds surrounding me grew increasingly louder, making it evident that I was being pursued. The pursuers were no longer attempting to conceal their presence. I pressed on, too frightened to glance back, but eventually, the urge became overwhelming, and I dared to look over my shoulder. I counted at least 6 individuals, all clad in white, rushing towards me. I continued my flight, aware that my vehicle was not far away. The ensuing minutes were among the most harrowing I have ever faced, as I battled both exhaustion and the looming threat of death. Slowing down was not an option. My very survival depended on my speed. At last, I spotted my car in the distance, with a police officer positioned right behind it. I reached his vehicle and collapsed, nearly on the verge of vomiting, before he could utter a word. When I turned around, the figures that had been pursuing me had vanished. The officer informed me that he had already contacted the authorities, for which I was immensely grateful. I provided him with a detailed account of the incident, and what he revealed was chilling. He explained that Utah has the largest population of Mormons in the nation, and it is rare to encounter individuals from the woods in unmarked forests. The particular forest I had been exploring possessed a rich history, particularly concerning woodland cults and religious sections. The officer suggested that I had likely stumbled upon one such group and cautioned me against venturing into unfamiliar areas of the woods. In truth, what that officer told me all those years ago was likely accurate. I find it difficult to comprehend the situation. If they were indeed upset about my trespassing on their property, I fail to understand why they did not simply communicate their concerns to me. It seems unnecessary for them to pursue and intimidate me in the woods, particularly after damaging my tires. This incident continues to occupy my thoughts frequently. I do not consider myself an expert hiker. However, I have been passionately engaged in this activity for several decades. I have explored all the prominent trails across America and visited over 75% of the nation's stunning national parks. Consequently, I have sought new ways to invigorate my hiking experiences. Recently, I have taken up a unique hobby of examining Google Maps for lesser-known forests and venturing into them. While this approach may be unconventional, I find the thrill it brings to be worth the potential risk of losing my way. To mitigate this, I carry a set of homemade route marking stickers that I affix to trees as I navigate the area. I remove them as I pass to avoid leaving any litter behind. I am surprised that more individuals have not adopted this method, as it significantly reduces the chances of becoming lost in a forest. On this occasion, I faced a more challenging endeavor, exploring Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut. This location would likely give pause to any ordinary individual, as the entire town has been deserted since the 1800s, accompanied by various eerie tales and accounts. If you are intrigued by such stories, I recommend conducting some research. Personally, I am not superstitious and do not subscribe to ghostly narratives. Although this forest is technically restricted to the public, that has not deterred me in the past. I appreciated the likelihood of encountering no one else in those woods, which is typically my preference. I also hail from New England, so the drive was relatively manageable. I entered the woods around noon to ensure that I would complete my hike before sunset. My initial impression of the woods was quite unsettling. I had heard that it was eerily silent, and I was taken aback to find that it truly was. One does not fully appreciate the myriad sounds of the forest until they are absent. It was akin to closing one's eyes in a quiet room and only being aware of one's own breathing. To be candid, this silence was not entirely unfamiliar to me, as I had previously experienced forests devoid of wildlife. As I continued my walk, placing my markers along the way, I attempted to dispel the eerie sensation that the forest was evoking. I kept anticipating that I would eventually encounter an animal, or at least some sign of life, but my hopes were in vain. After some time, I found myself wishing for the company of another person. Such was my level of discomfort. However, before long, the forest's silence ceased to trouble me as much. For the first time since entering those woods, I felt a sense of calm. Unfortunately, this feeling was short-lived. Suddenly, I became aware of a sound that reignited my unease. It resembled a wailing or moaning noise, akin to what one might expect from a wounded animal. That is the best description I can provide. I continue to find it challenging to articulate the experience, even now. It was particularly unsettling, as it was the sole sound resonating throughout the entire forest. I halted and listened intently, attempting to discern its source. I had never encountered anything resembling it before. While it could have been a whistling caused by the wind, the absence of any breeze rendered that explanation implausible. I ultimately surmised that it was likely the cry of a wounded animal, despite my awareness that this was probably not the case. I chose to distance myself from the sound until it gradually diminished. You may be curious as to why I did not simply turn back at that moment. I wish I could provide a satisfactory answer. I reassured myself that if I encountered one more unsettling occurrence, I would leave immediately. As I continued walking, I pondered how an animal could sustain an injury in such a forest. Was there a hunter present? Surely, I would have heard a gunshot. Perhaps the shot had been fired before I arrived. Or maybe the hunter had failed to end the animal's suffering. Could someone truly act in such a manner? It was difficult to fathom. My mind was racing with these thoughts when I unexpectedly came across something carved into the tree directly ahead of me. There were, without a doubt, engravings. I recognize that this may sound cliché, but I assure you I am being completely sincere. The carvings were composed of symbols that did not resemble letters. They appeared as random slashes and patches of missing bark. As I surveyed my surroundings, I noticed that several nearby trees bore similar markings. I reached a breaking point and, without a second thought, turned around to retrace my steps, removing my trail markers as I passed them. Although I am inherently curious, even I found myself thinking it was time to abandon this endeavor. I followed my markers for a while until I noticed something unfamiliar in the distance, a structure that resembled a bear's den or perhaps a cave. I halted, perplexed, as I knew there was no way I could have missed something as significant as a bear's den. It suddenly dawned on me that my trail markers should have been positioned at shoulder height, not waist height. A chill ran through me as I turned and began to sprint back the way I had come, glancing over my shoulder repeatedly. How could I have been so careless? Someone had clearly moved my markers to entice me into that cave. The thought that someone might have been tracking me all along was terrifying. I had no time to ponder these questions. My sole focus was on escaping the forest. The problem was that, without those markers, I was effectively lost. I continued to run, disregarding any need for silence, as it would have been futile. The forest was eerily quiet except for the noise I was making. I paused to catch my breath and pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal. Miraculously, I managed to get one bar. I located my parked car on the map and determined the direction I needed to take. I was not far from safety, but just as quickly as the signal appeared, it vanished. Nevertheless, I now knew my route, and that was when the wailing resumed, louder than before. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, despite the fact that my most physically fit years were behind me. The sound seemed to be emanating from just behind me, yet every time I turned to look, I found nothing. After enduring the most harrowing 10 minutes of my existence, I finally reached the edge of the forest, at which point the wailing ceased abruptly. I quickly jumped into my car and drove away, ensuring that whatever had been pursuing me would not catch up. That day effectively ruined hiking for me. Here is my logical interpretation of the events. It is possible that a hermit or an eccentric individual resides in those woods and noticed me before I became aware of him. For reasons unknown, he tracked my movements and tampered with my trail markers, presumably to lure me toward a cave. I suspect he possessed a whistle or some device that produced the wailing sound, which is why it stopped so suddenly when he realized he could not catch me. I acknowledge that there are flaws in this explanation, such as how someone could blow a whistle for an extended period while simultaneously running at full speed. I welcome any alternative explanations, as there may be a valid reason for the restrictions placed on that forest for civilians. In my youth, my childhood residence served as the ideal location for gatherings with friends, and several factors contributed to this. My father had an expansive man cave in the basement, stocked with an almost endless supply of beer. Additionally, my parents typically allowed us to drink down there and largely left us to our own devices. The property was quite spacious, bordered by a reasonably sized wooded area. If one were to traverse the woods from my home, they would eventually arrive at a dirt road, beyond which lay the reservoir, a place that has held a special place in my heart since childhood. I had cut numerous holes in the reservoir fence, so many that the Water Commission eventually ceased repairs, as it is illegal for civilians to trespass on reservoir property. Nevertheless, as a child, it was my sanctuary. I would go there to smoke, escape my parents, swim, and reflect. It was truly a beautiful location, likely the only aspect of that period in my life that I genuinely miss. One day, while my friends and I were playing pool in the basement with loud EDM music playing in the background, my friend Chester proposed the idea of hiking through the woods to the reservoir. As boredom began to set in, we all agreed, especially since the sun was still up, making navigation easier. There were 5 of us: Chester, Rick, Jasper, Hassan, and myself. While I cannot recall every detail, I believe Rick and Hassan managed to procure some beers for the trip, as they were the designated drinkers in our group. I had consumed a few drinks prior, so I was cautious not to indulge excessively. The reservoir was vast, and even after crossing the fence, we still had a considerable distance to cover. The ground in the woods remained somewhat muddy from the earlier rainfall, but we were already committed to our plan. We typically relaxed on a cliff located on the near side, so that was our destination for the evening. However, after some time, we opted to continue our walk and explore the far side of the reservoir. To reach that area, we needed to walk along the near side until we reached the end, where we could then cut across to the opposite side. This would allow us to stroll along the far side until we arrived at a particularly smooth section we referred to as the beach. After approximately 20 minutes of walking, we finally found ourselves on the far side of the reservoir. It was at this point that things began to take a strange turn. Hassan raised his hand and pointed into the distance. Although we were on the far side of the oval-shaped reservoir, we had not yet reached the beach. Hassan was indicating to our right, where we noticed something moving toward the reservoir on the same side, albeit much further down. The 5 of us fell silent, observing as the dark figure gradually approached the water. We felt a sense of excitement, as this could lead to an encounter, which we typically welcomed, as the figure continued its approach from the woods toward the water. We observed that an individual was dragging something along the ground, and as they progressed, it became increasingly visible. Eventually, we discerned that it was a large black garbage bag, which appeared to contain something of considerable weight, as evidenced by the person's slow pace. While I do not wish to jump to conclusions, it is worth noting that several bodies have been discovered in that reservoir over the years, leading us to quickly assume the worst. Our expressions turned serious, and we fell silent, fixated on the figure who we suspected was transporting a body toward the water's edge. Upon reaching the water, the individual knelt beside the bag for several minutes, and from our distance, we could not ascertain his actions. Recognizing this as an opportune moment to leave, we prepared to depart. However, before we could do so, Chester noticed something else that halted us. 3 additional figures emerged from the woods, 2 of whom were dragging bags, while the third carried a kayak above his head. A wave of nausea washed over me. I resided merely 10 minutes from one of the most crime-ridden towns in America, and if this situation were gang-related, it would not be surprising. The first man we had seen climbed into the kayak, and the other three assisted in placing one of the bags onto his lap. He then paddled out to the center of the reservoir, and we watched as the garbage bag sank beneath the water's surface. He returned to shore and repeated this process 2 more times. Just then, as if scripted in a film, my phone rang, the jarring tones slicing through the stillness, and my anxious self scrambled to silence it as quickly as possible. The 4 men abruptly halted and turned to face us, prompting our immediate flight. In that instant, the tranquility of my backyard reservoir was irretrievably lost. Rick glanced back and shouted that they were in pursuit, marking the most terrifying moment of my life. Running through a forest proved to be exceedingly challenging, especially with the looming threat of danger, which intensified the experience. We sprinted back down the bank, crossed over, and began navigating through the woods on the nearby side, aiming for the hole in the fence. Whether it was the adrenaline or the alcohol, or perhaps a combination of both, I could not recall the location of the hole. I reached the fence first, with my friends trailing closely behind, and they began to panic as they observed me aimlessly tracing the fence, desperately searching for an opening that could be located anywhere. We continued along the fence, and just as I was about to concede defeat, Rick pointed ahead and shouted that it was merely a few feet away. We dashed toward it, and as I assisted Chester through, we heard the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping nearby, indicating that they were gaining on us. The pursuit did not conclude there. We raced through the woods back to my backyard, feeling a wave of relief upon our arrival. It was at that moment that Hassan contacted the police, informing them of the situation. They assured us that a squad car would be dispatched to my residence without delay. I was aware that I would face repercussions for trespassing, but at that moment, my primary concern was the safety of my friends. However, I remained uneasy, as the distance from the reservoir to my house was not significant, and they could easily follow the trail we had left behind. The police eventually arrived and listened to our accounts. They conducted a search of my property for any indications that we had been followed, and my heart sank when they discovered evidence. A set of muddy footprints led to my backyard fence, which I assured the officers did not belong to us. When they inquired if I was certain, I affirmed my position, questioning why I would scale my own fence. Fortunately, the police did not find anyone concealed on my property, and they departed, promising to keep me informed about the situation at the reservoir. To my astonishment, they actually followed through. A few days later, the police recovered 3 bodies from the reservoir, which became a significant news story for some time. My parents and I lived in fear for an extended period, knowing that criminals were aware of our residence. For months afterward, my mother insisted she saw figures in the woods at night and even reported witnessing a camera flash on one occasion. This incident was a primary factor in our decision to move from that house. Fast forward to the present, and as far as I am aware, the police have not established any connections or made any arrests. I am compelled to recount this now because I recently came across a distressing news article about a teenager who drowned in that reservoir, which resurfaced all these memories. That location certainly feels cursed, and I continue to ponder the numerous tragedies that may have occurred there, remaining unknown to the public. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the strange and unexpected. If you enjoyed the story, hit that like button, share with fellow curious minds, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Until next time, stay curious, stay intrigued,